When we think of evolution, many of us have a number of different and often conflicting views of what evolution really is. What we're going to be doing here is looking at how the concept of evolution developed as a theory. First of all, let's review some key concepts that we need to understand. Species. The term species refers to all organisms that can mate and reproduce in nature. Population may best be defined as a group of organisms of the same species that live in a given area. And one definition of evolution is genetic changes in a population over many generations. So with these important terms in mind, let's now look at the development of evolutionary concepts. Now, first of all, what does evolution seek to explain? What is really evolution all about? Historically, evolution was designed to answer questions of how does life evolve with respect to diversity of life? Why do we have so many species and how did they all evolve? Secondly, do organisms have a common shared ancestry? Thirdly, where do species really evolve? And maybe lastly, do species disappear? Now, for thousands of years, these questions were basic to an understanding of how humans fit within the overall scheme of living organisms. Now, historically, we can look at some prevailing thought during the 19th century. First of all, going back, obviously, prior to this, Aristotle believed that all species were fixed. In other words, the Creator put all these organisms in place. I should say in those days the gods put everything into place, and everything pretty much were fixed. As we move forward in history, the creationists came up with their view, of course, is quite biblical, that special creation by higher power, and this, of course, follows biblical tradition. Now, as we move towards the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, a number of scientists began to question creationism, the Aristotle concept, and so on. Lyell, for example, realized that the Earth was continuously changing geologically. Now, if the Earth is continuously changing geologically, does it not make sense that species also will change? Now we move to Lamarck, who believed that species do change, but they change through the process of passing on acquired characteristics. Now, we realize today that that is not the case, but Lamarck at least recognized the concept that species evolve. Now we go to Hutton, whose understanding of evolutionary concept looked at it this way. He believed that new species were basically degenerate forms of older species, which means that everything was created in a perfect form and that species evolved through a degeneration process. Of course, we know that's not true. And finally, we look at Cuvier. Cuvier understood fossils. He was a paleontologist, and he clearly showed that Earth was very old, that life existed millions of years ago, and that species came and species disappeared. This leads us, of course, to Charles Darwin. All of us have heard of Charles Darwin and evolution through natural selection. Now, of course, the famous trip of Charles Darwin took him around the world on the ship by the name of Beagle, and Charles was an observational biologist, and his purpose was to categorize the flora and fauna that the trip would come across. As you can see, his trip took him from England across South America, basically around the world. But for the most part, while he categorized lots and lots of things, the important area that really struck his imagination and eventually helped him to evolve the evolutionary theory that we know today by vis-a-vis natural selection was his experience in 1835 on the Galapagos Island. The Galapagos Island, as you can see, is off of the coast of South America, just a few hundred miles. The Galapagos Island was a pristine natural environment where he saw hundreds and thousands of species of animals and plants that were continuously changing in his own mind. One of the key animals that he looked at that helped him evolve his theory of evolution was his observation of birds. Darwin's observation of this unique species of birds, the finches, as you can see on this slide, allowed him to think through some important concepts. He noticed that these finches existed on different islands off of the coast of Ecuador. He also recognized that on each island there appeared to be a different population of these animals. And he wondered why would it be that a given island should evolve a unique species of birds. So to answer this question as to why each island would have a unique species of birds, Darwin spent a lot of time trying to understand and explain why this happens. First of all, he believed that initially birds migrated to the island from the mainland. Secondly, as the population grew, food supply shrunk. Now, when the food supply shrunk, there was competition for food. As this competition continued, birds evolved with varied beak structures. Some beaks were bigger, some beaks were narrower, some beaks were longer, shorter, whatever. But the birds with a competitive beak structure became the dominant species. So therefore, each island evolved with its unique species of birds. Now, this is looking at a small microcosm of evolution. So when Darwin went back to his homeland in England, he thought about this a whole lot. In fact, he's thought about this for about 20 years before he came up with his encompassing theory of evolution. What then was Darwin's conclusion that led to his overriding theory of the origin of species? So let's list this carefully. First of all, what happens in nature is the following. Populations contain individuals with varied inherited characteristics. Secondly, in a given population, far more individuals are produced than can survive. We can see this in nature all the time. We can look in an ocean, we see lots and lots of fish being born, and how many survive? Very, very few. So individuals will compete for resources, food, shelter, mates, and so on. Now, during this competition, characteristics of some will give them a competitive advantage. And this competitive advantage allows them to survive the challenges of the environment. So, the mechanism of evolution is natural selection. Basically, what we're saying is nature selects those organisms that have the characteristics that best meet the environmental challenges. That's an important point to understand. Organisms evolve with unique characteristics, and those characteristics that can best meet the environmental needs, those organisms will survive, and that is basically the heart of Darwinian evolution. 20 years later, after being prompted by others who were kind of on to the same theory, Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859, and it became obviously an instant hit, and he became the dominant figure in the concept of evolutionary thought from 1859 until today. So, let's summarize now what natural selection really is all about. It is the differential survival and reproduction of an organism whose genetic characteristics better adapt them to a given environmental challenge. Now, when we think about this and we think of the historical aspects of Darwin and the time that he lived, Darwin understood clearly what artificial selection was. Now, I'm looking at natural selection versus artificial selection. What is the difference here? All of us are familiar with breeding of animals. We breed an animal because we breed an animal for characteristics that we particularly want. So we might breed a long, skinny little dog that couldn't possibly survive in nature, but we like that particular skinny little dog with skinny little legs. But what have we done? We have selected those characteristics that meet our needs. So this is an example of artificial selection. But the same thing occurs in nature. But in nature, characteristics evolve, not man, but nature selects the characteristics that it sees as a best fit for survival. So do we have evidence for natural selection? Do we have evidence for evolution? There's an overwhelming evidence for evolution by way of natural selection. We have radioactive dating. We can actually go and find fossils and determine exactly how old organisms are. We can trace life going back as far as 500 million years ago and even longer. We can actually, and we do this by way of radioactive dating. Now, fossils per se, if we look at layers and layers of fossils, we can determine extinction and evolution of new species. We can also look at embryological evidence. We can look at anatomical studies that show a common ancestry. And most important, we can look now at molecular biology, comparison of DNA from one organism to another organism that clearly shows relationships in the evolutionary process. And also, today, we can actually observe through experimental research, ongoing evolution in microbes and other organisms. Just to illustrate a few of these examples, we're looking at a trilobite that existed 370 million years ago. This is the ancestor to the common horseshoe crab. From embryological evidence, we can see quite clearly from an embryological point of view, we can look and see the development of organisms from different species, and we see they all have similar look. In this case, I'm looking at pharyngeal slits that existed in marine animals, in pond turtle, in the chicken, in the cat, and in the human. Of course, in the chicken and the cat and the human, these pharyngeal gill slits disappear because we no longer have gills. Point is that embryological evidence strongly points to common ancestry. In addition, we can look at anatomical evidence. In this case here, we're looking at the whale, the cat, the bat, and the gorilla. The appendages and the anatomical structure look quite similar, which means that this is no coincidence, that somehow these organisms are related. Molecular biology offers strong evidence for evolution and relationships between different species. We recognize that all organisms have the same genetic code. All organisms have DNA. If we look at a segment of DNA that codes for a given protein, we can see that the DNA from humans and yeast have broad differences. As we go to the moth, we see that the DNA from humans to moths are closer in terms of being alike. And as we move towards the pig, we see that the human and the pig are more closely related. Basically, what we're saying is that the DNA sequences of humans and other organisms become more and more similar as we start to acquire similar characteristics. If we look at a protein called cytochrome C, it is present in the yeast, the moth, the tuna, the snake, the duck, the pig, and the human. Now, the DNA that codes for this protein is slightly different. If we look at the DNA that codes for this protein, we can see that the DNA is significantly different from the human to the yeast. The difference becomes less from the human to the moth, and even less from the human to the tuna fish, yes, tuna, and from the human to the snake. And as we get closer to organisms that are more related to us, the difference becomes even less. In fact, the human DNA and the monkey DNA is virtually identical. Yes, we are very closely related to the primates, of course. So this, again, points to a common evolutionary process and relationship.